The first part to this process is to remove all the old hardware off the doors, and with multiple layers of paint found on old doors, I've found the easiest way to do this is to slowly start chipping away at the paint with a razor blade, especially the slots for the screws, until you can manage to get them out. Then using my skill saw, I trimmed the bottom half of one of the doors to 29 inches, which will be the height of my sides. I noticed that this door had been trimmed before, so one of my sides was larger than the other. If I cut down center on my door, both sides would be asymmetrical. In order to fix that, I ended up trimming 5/8 of an inch off of the one side to even out the symmetry, and then split the door down center for my two separate sides. With my door now symmetrical, I cut it dead center on the table saw and then trimmed the rough edges of the doors to 14 1/4. To square off the ends of my boards and end up with a 28-inch height on both sides, I clamped a scrap piece of 3/4 inch plywood to my table saw fence and used my miter gauge to send the piece through my saw blade. This little bump out of the 3/4 inch plywood will help eliminate binding of the blade against the wood by creating a space on the other side of the blade while using your miter gauge. I didn't have any grand plans for stripping all the paint off these doors, but the first set of doors I had, the paint was coming off easily enough that leaving it on would have created a bad finish, so I stripped it down to the original varnish. Once I was done with that, I sanded both doors with 80 grit sandpaper just to roughen them up and give something for the new paint to adhere to. I started work on my second door, which will become my top and bottom. I wanted to start out with 73 inches, which would be the top, so I cut 3.5 inches off one side of the door, and to keep the symmetry, 1.5 inches off the bottom side of the door with my skill saw. Once I had that 73 inches for my top, I set my table saw fence to 14 1/4 and ripped the door down it. This will become the base. I left the other side, the top, wider at 15 1/8, which will allow for me to put a face frame on the front of the cab. Since the top and bottom of the cabinet are made out of a different door than the side panels, the paint was not in bad shape, and I was able just to rough it up with 80 grit sandpaper. Now I was ready to cut all the dados into the sides and tops of my cabinet. In order to do this, I like to orient my sides like a book opening, just to make sure I mark on the right face and the right top and bottom of the piece. The first dados I cut were on the inside of my side panels, 2.5 inches up from the bottom. This will accept my base of my cabinet. If you don't know how to cut dados, we have a video. I'll put a link in the description on how to cut dados, and we actually will show you how to build this jig, which is perfect for using a router to cut dados. Next, I marked and cut 2 dados on either side of the underside of my top, which will be the dados that are going to receive the side panels. Now with the dado cut, you could see why I love working with these old doors, because not only are they solid wood that are put together with adjoining cope and stick joints on the sides, but they also have huge, I don't know if you can see it in the video, they have huge dowels going through the bottom parts of the door. And you could see that with the dado cut, which just adds to stability. Depending on how old your door is, chances are you have a pretty big mortise hole right where the doorknob was, where the lockbox was installed. Mine is 5/8 thick, 4 inches long, and 3 3/8 inch deep. This hole's not going to really mess with the structural integrity of the piece, but it's still kind of smart to fill them. So I happen to have a 5/8 inch piece of plywood on hand, and I just cut it to fit. And before final assembly, I'll fill this with Gorilla Glue. I usually don't use Gorilla Glue, but it's perfect for filling in these little voids in the mortise. So I mounted the two side panels and the dados upside down, because now you want to get the measurement from the dado in this side panel to that side panel and cut your bottom. Measure from the inside of each dado. Mine's going to be 70 1/2. While you're doing this, keep a square in both corners to make sure that these are square to the base to get a proper measurement. So in order to keep the symmetry on both sides of the door, I'm trimming each side just a little bit to get that 70 1/2. You also want to keep a solid piece here, because if you cut too far into the molding, you'll lose the joint that's holding the door together. So I usually make these cuts free-handed, but if you don't feel capable of your skills with the circular saw, you can set up a fixed fence that the saw will ride against to make that cut straight. Then measure and mark the other side and trim to length as well. So before I dry fit this together for the first time, I put a 1/2 inch dado stack in my table saw with a sacrificial fence to cut a rabbet on the back side of all 4 pieces. So I marked all the backs with the B, obviously, and the rabbets I cut I made a 1/2 inch wide by a 1/2 inch deep. And then I made the exact same cut on the top and the bottom of my panels. Once it's dry fitted together, you can see how that rabbet runs along the entire perimeter of the cabinet and is where you'll attach your backer board for the cabinet. So this is it, the carcass together, and I left the overhang in the front because there's going to be a face frame on this that will come out 3/4 of an inch. So normally I would frame out the vertical partitions for the inside of this cabinet with 3/4 inch veneered plywood. I don't have that on hand right now, or at least a piece big enough on hand. And I pretty much will do anything to avoid going to the store. So I happen to have this piece of, this was actually from a project we did a couple months ago, turning bunk beds into just a loft bed. So this was the leftover headboard, and it's solid poplar with this beadboard inlay. So I'm just going to rip this right down the middle. So the front of this to the back rabbet is 13 11/16. So I'm going to cut my headboard at 13 11/16. If you're making this, you're most likely cutting plywood. So same measurement, different material. I marked center on my vertical panels and used that to divide the base of the cabinet into 3 equal pieces for the 3 compartments of my cabinet. Next, I cut 2 dados in the base and 2 dados in the top of my cabinet, which is where those vertical panels will go. In order to expedite this process, I perfectly aligned the base of my cabinet with the top of the cabinet and then used my dado jig to cut one big dado at once. If you align these properly, not only does it save you on time, but you'll know that the top and bottom dados are perfectly parallel to each other. So with the vertical supports in place, you want to check everything for square. And then there's going to be 3 doors on this, but on the top they're going to be little coveys to hold VCR and the cable box. So the face frame I'm going to make as thick as the wood. So with the leftover piece I cut off, I'm marking a mark how thick that'll be. And then down from there I marked 5 inches on my lumber, and then 3/4 for the dado because these shells will be made out of plywood. I'll take it apart and cut all those on the table saw. There are a couple modifications I made to the center vertical pieces before I cut my dados, and that is adding these 1/4-inch shims. The reason for that is this one will line up with your cut dado so that there's something for the piece you put here to sit in, and also the one in the back on both sides, because there will be shelf pins for the bottom shelves, and you could put one here but you would have had nothing to put into here. So to do that, I just had this 1/4-inch plywood and I ripped it down, and I'm just going to put brads in it to keep it in place, and then I could cut my dados. If you use plywood, you won't have to do this. So this is what it looks like with all the pieces lined up for the dado. So the squiggle represents what's already going to be in a dado, and these are shorter dados because the pieces I had for that weren't long enough to match the height of these. And then the FF stands for where the face frame will be. The open is going to be how wide the shelves are, and then the 3/4-inch dado we're going to cut on the top side of these two, and then on either side of your middle pieces. Then I took a scrap piece of 3/4-inch plywood and cut 3 shelves at 13 5/8, which is the same width as all my verticals. Then I trimmed the shelves to width to match the 3 slightly different sized openings of my cabinet. Then it's time for glue up, which basically consists of moving really fast to apply glue to all your dados and then attaching all the pieces. I don't have a ton of super long clamps, so I clamp everything into place temporarily and add some screws through the back side of my dados into each panel to keep them in place while everything dries. I attached the top, making sure to keep that overhang in the front to allow for the thickness of your face frame. If you have any glue dripping down from your joints, you can use some sawdust to clean everything up. Lastly, I check all the corners of all the cubbies for square before adding the final screws for dry up.